How does the brain of a child prodigy work? When he watched his son, at 5 years old, it was January of 1761, and he watched him clamber onto the chair or bench where he was just concluding a lesson with Mozart's older sister. And Mozart somehow was able not only to play back what he had heard, but to improvise on his own. Leopold Mozart wrote about this to friends and described it as a miracle, because of course a miracle is something which shouldn't happen. It defies natural laws in some way, and yet this is the only word he could think of to describe his son. It's interesting to note that in German, the term Wunderkind could be translated as a miracle child or a wonder child. In English, we usually use the term a child prodigy. Now, this delves more into the realm of really neuroscience more than anything to understand how the mind of a Wunderkind works. How was Mozart able to compose all the works that he composed in his youth? Some of which, by the way, are very impressive pieces. We will look at such a piece when we analyze the motet Exsultate, Jubilate, written when Mozart was just about 17 years old. Mozart had written other significant works before that, including operas and concerti and symphonies. How is this possible? Most neuroscientists point to memory as the defining factor here. Simply put, Wunderkinder, or child prodigies, have a very empowered hippocampus, the part of the brain that stores memory. And this allows them to build memory structures which enable them to assimilate information at a rate which, quote unquote, normal people would not be able to do. In other words, how did Mozart do what he did? The answer, my friends, he simply had a remarkable memory. And this checks out, if we think about Mozart's other musical attributes. His sense of oral recall, which we will discuss at some point later in this program, was exceptional, extraordinarily heightened. Mozart could hear things and transcribe them, even hours or days later. Imagine that. Imagine you heard something that you'd never heard before, and you could simply write it down, render it in written notation, sheet music, if you will. To most people, including most professional musicians, the idea of doing this, especially with a complex piece, is daunting. For Mozart, it would have been as easy as breathing in some ways. So we will look at that later. Mozart, a miracle. How do we define the miracle? Well, in many ways, it comes down to memory. We've talked about some of the significant milestones in Mozart's youth, and we will talk more about his youth momentarily, but here are some basic biographical details, more or less agreed upon in the scholarship. Mozart began composing around the age of 6. 6, my friends. Let me remind you that this is an age when most children, or at least many children, are still wearing pull-ups to bed. Mozart was already writing significant musical compositions. It's also worth pointing out that he had also developed by this point facility with multiple languages. Mozart loved language and became facile in several languages, including, of course, French and Italian. He also had a very firm grip of Latin, and even later in his life would try his hand at English. He was never very good at it, but had very limited exposure in his defense. Some basic details that we'll want to consider. By the age of 18, he had written 30 symphonies. By the age of 11, he had written a piano concerto, which is essentially a soloistic work written for piano with orchestral accompaniment. You might say more than accompaniment, that a concerto is more about opposition. The word concerto comes from the Latin concertare, which means to vie against, to oppose. It implies a dichotomous relationship, and indeed, that is the case in a concerto. He had written his first opera, Bastien und Bastien, by the age of 12, and within 2 years was working on operas that would be premiered on Italian stages, written for celebrated singers such as the Italian castrato Venanzio Rossini, a castrato singer we'll talk about a little bit later in the program. The nature of the Wunderkind, as we said, remains nebulous today. It's very difficult to point to any one thing because this happens within the recesses of the human mind. All the synapses that are firing, all the data which is being processed and stored in the hippocampus. In the 18th century, however, they weren't thinking about synapses firing, of course. They believed, as many still do today, that if you possess the skills of a Wunderkind, it must mean that you are favored somehow by God. And of course, the name Amadeus, if we trace the Latin, ama, lover of, deus, God, so loved or beloved by God. It's worth pointing out that one of Mozart's German names was Theophilus, or that was the Latin. Rather, the German name would be Gottlieb, which means the same thing. So Mozart, Amadeus, Gottlieb, Theophilus. All these things mean the same thing, beloved by God. Why did Mozart's father and mother name him that? Probably it had to do with the fact that they had experienced great loss between their children. 6 children were born to the Mozart family, the Mozart parents, Leopold and Maria Anna. Only 2 survived, and so the one who did survive was given the name, was beloved of God, Amadeus. Mozart's father was more than just a violinist and a pedagogue and a composer. He was a businessman, savvier at business than his son would ever grow up to be. Leopold decided to share this miracle with Europe, and so he took his children, both of whom were exceptionally talented Wunderkinder, or child prodigies, all over Europe. Much of the time was spent in Italy, some was spent traveling through France, much of it was spent in the German-speaking lands, that would be Austria and Germany. They even traveled as far as England, where Mozart and his sister almost died of smallpox. Fortunately, they survived. Of course, in the late 18th century, smallpox was a very deadly malady that claimed the lives of many. During his travels, it's interesting to note that Mozart delighted in interacting with older people. This is significant because it might help us explain the mystery of Mozart's sense of humor, which we'll get to in a bit. Many of you know that Mozart had a very peculiar sense of humor, one which was fairly accurately chronicled in the movie Amadeus. A lot of this, we think, comes from the fact that Mozart, as a young man, a boy really, didn't really interact with other children, but rather interacted with adults, grown members of orchestras and choruses and the like. And therefore, he would have been around adults and been immersed in and steeped in adult humor and sort of conversational norms. So why was Mozart the way he was in his adult? Well, that enigma can perhaps be explained by looking into how he spent his youth. And he spent much of his youth on the road. He won many plaudits during this period. That won't surprise anybody. Let me give you a couple of significant ones. Mozart was accepted into one of the most advanced and really, if we think about it in historical terms, one of the most difficult to get into musical societies in the late 18th century. And this, required extensive testing. And Mozart, at the age of 14, basically impressed the Italian masters so much that they readily admitted him into this society. Mozart also received the Order of the Golden Spur from a pope, and after which Mozart signed his letters, again, as a teenager, Chevalier Mozart. In other words, it was a knighthood of sorts, this Order of the Golden Spur. So many impressive feathers in the cap. That's not surprising. When we look at music written during Mozart's youth, one of the great gems from this period must be the sacred motet Exsultate, jubilate, rejoice, resound with joy. Oh, you souls, beautiful souls. This was written when the composer was all of 17 years old. That's an age when most kids now are, of course, learning to drive. For Mozart, he was writing brilliant concert music. This particular piece shows us that Mozart was not only skilled in writing for the human voice, a skill that would remain a hallmark, a staple of his style throughout his life, but he was also an extremely skilled orchestrator, somebody who had tremendous facility, not only writing notes, but also assigning those notes to the various instruments of the orchestra, tapping into what we refer to as timbre or sound color, what the Germans call Klangfarbe. Different instruments in the orchestra have different sound profiles, and therefore who you assign a note to or what instrument you assign a note to is a significant decision that composers have to meditate on. Mozart shows us here that at the age of 17, he was already incredibly gifted in this regard.